She thought she knew how this story would end, until he chose her. Isabella Lancaster's heart raced as she stood in the grand ballroom, her father's words still echoing in her mind. "Take the pretty one," he had said, offering her beautiful sister Emily to the Duke of Harrington. But as Isabella's gaze met Duke William's, everything changed. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, waiting for her to be nothing more than the second choice. The whispers started, a chorus of pity and judgment swirling around her. But Duke William didn't look at Emily. His piercing gaze was locked on Isabella, the girl who had been overlooked her whole life, the girl no one ever noticed. Her father had always thought Emily was the one to secure their future, the one to save the family. But it wasn't Emily he wanted. The Duke slowly approached her, his every step carrying the weight of expectation. Isabella's hands trembled, not from fear, but from something she couldn't quite name. The room fell silent as he stood before her. "I choose you," he said, his voice calm but filled with an undeniable resolve. Isabella blinked, caught off guard by the depth of his words. Was he truly speaking to her? She was the rejected sister, the one no one saw. For so long, she had been the invisible one, the one whose beauty was never enough to capture attention, the one whose worth was always questioned. But here he was, choosing her. The crowd gasped, the whispers now louder, full of disbelief. Her father's face flushed with frustration, but Isabella didn't look away from the Duke's steady gaze. She had never imagined this moment would come, not in a million years. She had never expected to be the one chosen. "You don't want Emily?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, though her heart pounded in her chest. "No," the Duke replied simply, his eyes never leaving hers. Isabella's world spun as she tried to process what was happening. She had been prepared to step aside, to let her beautiful sister take the lead, to live a life of quiet disappointment. But now, everything was changing. She was seen. She was chosen. The Duke's hand reached out to her, offering her something more than just marriage. He was offering her a future, a chance to stand beside him, not as the sister in the shadows, but as the woman he desired. The moment stretched, each second stretching into eternity, until Isabella finally took his hand. The room remained silent, watching as the Duke led her away, her life forever altered. She had been the one no one saw, but now, she was the one who mattered. And in that moment, Isabella Lancaster understood that this was just the beginning of her new life. Isabella's heart was still racing as she stood in the Duke's presence, the weight of his words lingering in the air. The room had erupted into whispers, but she felt oddly calm, as if she were floating outside of time. Duke William's steady gaze never wavered, his hand still holding hers. Every nerve in her body tingled with confusion and something else, something unfamiliar, something powerful. For the first time, she was seen. She was chosen, not as a second choice, not as the invisible sister, but as the one he truly wanted. She could hardly breathe, her mind still struggling to understand why he would choose her. "Why me?" Isabella's voice was soft, barely a whisper, but he heard her, his eyes darkening with emotion. "Because you're not like the others," he said, his voice low and firm, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as her. "You have a strength others don't see." Isabella's chest tightened at his words. Strength? She had never thought of herself as strong. She had always been the quiet one, the one who stood in Emily's shadow, the one who was easily overlooked. But here, in front of this powerful man, she felt something stir within her, a flicker of something she had never allowed herself to feel before. Hope. The Duke led her through the ballroom, and as they moved, the whispers grew louder, but they didn't bother her. The moment she had feared, the moment she had imagined would come, had finally arrived. And in that moment, she realized that it no longer mattered. The world could talk, could gossip, could criticize. She was with him now. She was the one he had chosen. The Duke stopped at a grand window, the cool night air swirling around them as they gazed out over the gardens. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone, Isabella," he said, his tone almost gentle. "Not to your father, not to the people who expect you to play a part. You're more than just an arrangement. You're my choice." Isabella's heart fluttered in her chest, and she had to remind herself to breathe. This was real. This was happening, and it was nothing like she had imagined. She had always believed that love, that connection, was something she would have to fight for, something that would come at a great cost. But here, in this quiet moment with the Duke, it felt like everything had fallen into place. "I don't know how to be the one you want," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. The Duke's eyes softened as he reached out to take her hand again. "You don't need to know," he said. "All I ask is that you be yourself." For the first time in her life, Isabella felt like she could do just that. Be herself. No longer the invisible sister, no longer the one living in the shadows. She could be the woman he chose. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Isabella sat quietly in the Duke's study, the weight of the day still heavy on her mind. The world outside was dark, the soft glow of the fire the only source of light in the room. Her fingers traced the edge of a book, her thoughts drifting. She had been chosen. The Duke, William Harrington, had chosen her. But the reality of that decision was still settling in. She had never imagined that the life she had always felt destined for, one of quiet submission, would shift so drastically. It was all too overwhelming. William's presence filled the doorway, his tall frame framed by the soft light from the hallway. He was as commanding as ever, his sharp gaze always calculating, yet now softened with something else, something unexpected. He stepped inside, the door closing softly behind him. "You're quiet tonight," he remarked, his voice gentle but with an undercurrent of concern. Isabella looked up, meeting his eyes. "I'm just trying to understand," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "This is all so new." William walked toward her, his footsteps deliberate, his presence unmistakable. "You don't need to understand everything all at once," he said, his tone steady, yet laced with an understanding she had not expected. "You're allowed to take your time." Isabella nodded, but the doubts lingered. Her life had always been dictated by the rules of society, by the expectations placed on her by her family. Now, here she was, in a situation that had no clear rules, no path to follow. The choice had been made, and yet, she was still uncertain. "I never thought someone like you would choose me," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I've always been in Emily's shadow." William paused in front of her, his gaze softening as he looked down at her. "You are not in anyone's shadow," he said firmly, his voice thick with sincerity. "You are your own person, Isabella. And that is why I chose you." Isabella's heart fluttered at his words, but a part of her remained skeptical. Was it truly her he wanted, or had it all been part of some arrangement, some duty he felt obligated to fulfill? William reached out, gently lifting her chin so their eyes met. "You think too much," he said with a small smile. "You have nothing to prove to me. Just be yourself." Isabella could feel the weight of his words, and though a part of her still clung to the doubts, she couldn't ignore the way his touch made her feel, seen, valued, like she was more than just a pawn in her father's game. For the first time in her life, Isabella felt like she mattered, not because of her beauty, not because of her family, but because of who she was in that moment. William's hand stayed on her chin for a moment longer, and then he slowly let go, stepping back slightly. "We'll take it one step at a time," he said, his voice steady, reassuring. Isabella smiled faintly, her heart still heavy, but lighter than it had been before. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. William nodded, his gaze never leaving her. "No need to thank me. You belong here, Isabella. And you always will." The words settled in her chest, a promise she wasn't sure she could fully believe just yet, but one that filled her with a hope she hadn't known was possible. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in her life, Isabella felt like she had a choice in her own story. Isabella sat alone in the garden the next afternoon, the warmth of the sun on her skin a stark contrast to the turmoil inside her. She had spent the morning wandering the halls of the estate, trying to find some sense of normalcy in a life that was anything but. The garden, with its blooming roses and vibrant flowers, was the only place where she could find peace. But even here, her mind was far from quiet. Duke William's words echoed in her thoughts. "You belong here, Isabella." How could she believe him? How could she believe that she was truly his choice and not some obligation, some duty he had to fulfill for the sake of appearances? She had been raised to believe she was only as valuable as what she could offer, and what had she ever offered except for her beauty, her family's name? But with William, it was different. He had seen something in her that no one else had. He had chosen her for reasons she couldn't yet understand. And that thought, That knowledge terrified her. A rustling sound broke her from her thoughts. She looked up to see William approaching, his tall figure cutting through the flowers like a shadow. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. "Isabella," he said, his voice soft yet firm. "We need to talk." She stood slowly, the weight of his presence making her heart race. "What about?" she asked, her voice shaky. He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to read her thoughts. "About us," he said simply. "About where this is going." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. "I don't know where it's going," she admitted. "I'm still trying to understand why you chose me." William's gaze softened, and for the first time since their encounter in the ballroom, he reached out to gently touch her arm. "I chose you because I see you, Isabella. Not because of your beauty, not because of your family. I chose you because you are more than just a title or an image. You have a strength, a depth that most people can't see. I see it in you every day." Isabella felt the weight of his words settle over her. She had never thought of herself as strong. She had always been the quiet one, the one who stayed in the background, unnoticed and unimportant. But William made her feel like she mattered. And that, more than anything, terrified her. "I don't know if I can be what you want," she whispered. "I don't know how to be what you need." William stepped closer, his presence overwhelming yet comforting. "You don't have to be anything, Isabella," he said, his voice low and sincere. "You just need to be yourself. That's all I've ever wanted." Isabella's heart ached at his words, a mixture of relief and fear flooding her. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that she was enough just as she was, but a part of her still doubted. She had spent so long hiding in the shadows, living in the expectations of others, that the thought of standing in the light, of being seen for who she truly was, felt impossible. "I'm scared," she confessed, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I'm scared of being vulnerable, of being seen, of giving myself to someone and having them leave." William's expression softened, and he reached out to cup her cheek gently. "You don't have to be afraid, Isabella. I'm not going anywhere. Not unless you ask me to." His words were a promise, one she wasn't sure she could trust yet, but something in his touch, in the way he looked at her, made her believe him. Slowly, she nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm not going anywhere either," she whispered. And for the first time since their encounter, Isabella felt a sense of peace, as if, just maybe, everything could be okay. She didn't have all the answers, and the future was still uncertain. But for the first time in her life, she was ready to embrace whatever came next, with William by her side. The days that followed were filled with a new sense of anticipation for Isabella, though the uncertainty of her future still lingered in her heart. She walked the halls of the estate, her mind constantly returning to the Duke's words, "You are enough." Could she truly believe them? Could she really let go of the doubt that had been instilled in her all her life? William had given her something she never thought she would have, a place by his side. But a small part of her remained guarded, unsure if the reality of their connection would match the dream he had painted for her. It was early morning when she found herself walking through the grand library, her fingers grazing the spines of the books that lined the shelves. The estate had always felt like a foreign place to her, full of opulence and expectations. But now, it was beginning to feel like home, even if she wasn't sure yet how to fit in. "Isabella." William's voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to see him standing in the doorway, his eyes warm, his expression unreadable as always. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said, stepping into the room. Isabella smiled faintly, though her heart skipped a beat at the sight of him. He had become a constant in her life, even though she had never expected it. "You didn't," she replied softly. "I was just thinking." "About what?" he asked, walking closer. She hesitated for a moment before answering, her voice barely above a whisper. "About everything. About how this all feels so unreal. Like I'm waiting for something to go wrong." William stopped in front of her, his gaze steady. "You don't need to worry about that," he said gently. "I'm not going anywhere. And neither are you." She looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of uncertainty. But all she saw was sincerity. "I don't know how to stop being afraid," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to trust that this is real." William reached out, his hand cupping her cheek. "You don't have to stop being afraid," he said softly. "It's okay to be scared. I'll be here with you, every step of the way. You don't have to do this alone." Isabella closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability. His words, his touch, were a balm to the fears that had held her captive for so long. She had spent her life pushing down her emotions, trying to keep her true self hidden, but now, with him, she felt safe enough to let it all out. "I don't know what I'm doing," she whispered, "but I want to try. I want to believe that this can be real." William's thumb brushed against her skin, his touch tender. "Then we will try together," he said, his voice a quiet promise. Isabella opened her eyes, meeting his gaze, and in that moment, she felt something shift. The walls she had built around herself, the walls that had kept her from truly living, began to crumble. She had been afraid for so long, but now she was ready to face her fears, with him by her side. Slowly, William leaned in, his forehead resting gently against hers. "I'm here," he murmured, his voice soft but sure. "And I'm not going anywhere." Isabella smiled, the first real smile she had given in a long time. And for the first time since they had met, she truly believed him. This was real. And maybe, just maybe, it could be enough. The days grew into weeks, and Isabella slowly began to settle into her new life. The fear that had once consumed her seemed to fade, replaced by a quiet acceptance that she hadn't known she needed. With William's presence, the weight of her past was starting to lift, though the remnants of doubt still clung to her heart. She spent her mornings wandering the gardens, her afternoons in the estate's grand library, and the evenings with William, enjoying the comfort of his company. Yet, the stillness of their life together couldn't erase the memories of the past, the expectations placed on her, the whispers about her worth, the constant feeling of being overlooked. One afternoon, as Isabella walked through the halls of the estate, she passed a large portrait of her father, her family's proud history immortalized in gold and oil. For a moment, she paused, staring at it, feeling the familiar knot of discomfort twist in her stomach. She had always been her father's dutiful daughter, always striving to meet his expectations, always in the background, always second. But now, standing here, in this grand home, with William by her side, something inside her shifted. She wasn't that girl anymore. She wasn't the one who lived in the shadows of her family's name. She wasn't the one who had been overlooked. Isabella was her own person, someone worthy of being seen, of being chosen. "Isabella." William's voice called from behind, breaking her from her thoughts. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, his eyes full of concern. "Are you all right?" he asked. Isabella smiled faintly, her heart warmed by his presence. "I'm fine," she replied. "Just thinking." William stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "About what?" he asked, his tone soft but filled with genuine curiosity. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "About everything. About how things are changing. How I'm changing." William reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "Change can be scary," he said, his voice steady. "But it can also be freeing. And you don't have to face it alone." Isabella looked up at him, her heart swelling with emotion. She had spent so much of her life feeling isolated, trapped by the expectations of others. But with William, she no longer felt like she had to bear that weight alone. "I don't know if I'm ready," she admitted quietly. "I don't know if I can fully embrace this life, this new me." William smiled softly, his thumb brushing over her hand in a comforting motion. "You don't have to be ready right now. You don't have to have all the answers. Just take it one step at a time. And I'll be here, every step of the way." His words, so simple yet so powerful, filled her with a warmth she hadn't known she was missing. She had spent so long pushing away her fears, her insecurities, but with him, she felt like it was okay to let them in, to face them head on. For the first time in her life, Isabella felt like she was truly seen. Not for her family's title, not for the role she had been expected to play, but for who she was. And that was enough. Slowly, she nodded, her heart still heavy with uncertainty, but lightened by the promise of his unwavering support. "I'm willing to try," she said, her voice full of quiet determination. William squeezed her hand, his eyes shining with pride. "That's all I ask." As they stood there together, in the quiet of the estate, Isabella realized that she didn't need to have everything figured out. She didn't need to be perfect. All she needed was to be true to herself, and for the first time, she was ready to do just that. The weeks passed in a comfortable rhythm, with Isabella slowly finding her place in William's world. The estate, once imposing and unfamiliar, began to feel like home. The halls, the garden, even the library that had once felt so vast now held the promise of something more, something that was hers. With William by her side, Isabella no longer felt like a shadow in her own life. But despite the growing bond between them, a part of her still struggled to shed the insecurities that had been ingrained in her for so long. She had always been taught to be perfect, to live up to expectations, to remain quiet and unseen. But now, with William, she was learning to be herself, to accept herself as she was. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Isabella found herself in the garden once again. She had been walking for hours, lost in her thoughts, when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see William approaching, his expression thoughtful. "You've been out here for a while," he said, his voice gentle. Isabella smiled softly, feeling a calm wash over her. "Just thinking," she replied. "I feel like there's so much to process, so much to figure out." William stepped closer, his presence comforting. "You don't have to have everything figured out. You're allowed to take your time," he said, his eyes soft. Isabella looked up at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I know," she said quietly, "but sometimes I feel like I'm not enough. Like I'm not who you thought I would be." William reached out, his hand cupping her cheek. "You are more than enough, Isabella," he said softly. "You've always been enough. You just have to see it for yourself." Isabella's breath caught in her throat at his words. She had spent so long believing she was inadequate, that her worth was tied to what others expected of her. But with William, she was beginning to see herself in a different light. She wasn't just the daughter of her father, the one who had been overshadowed by her more beautiful sister. She was Isabella, a woman in her own right, worthy of love and respect. "I don't know if I can ever fully believe that," she said, her voice trembling. William's thumb gently brushed her cheek. "You don't have to believe it all at once," he said, his voice warm and reassuring. "But you're getting there, Isabella. And I'm here with you, every step of the way." Isabella closed her eyes, letting his words sink in. For the first time, she felt like she could breathe, like the weight of the world wasn't on her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. William smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice soft. "I'm just glad you're here." Isabella looked up at him, meeting his gaze. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the deep affection he had for her. And for the first time in her life, she believed it. She believed that she was worthy of his love, worthy of the life they were building together. Slowly, she reached up, placing her hand over his. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. "I'm ready to believe in us." William's smile widened, and he leaned down to kiss her forehead gently. "Then let's take this one step at a time, together." Isabella nodded, her heart full. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. And with William by her side, she knew she could face whatever came next. As the days continued to pass, Isabella found herself growing more comfortable with the life she was building alongside William. It wasn't perfect, not by any means, but it was real. And in that realness, Isabella began to discover parts of herself that had remained hidden for so long. She had always been taught to put others first, to remain in the background, and let the spotlight fall on those who deserved it more. But now, with William, she was starting to understand that her worth wasn't tied to how others saw her. It was tied to who she was. One afternoon, as the estate prepared for a grand event, Isabella stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the delicate fabric of her dress. The soft silk shimmered in the light, but it wasn't the dress that made her feel alive. It was the person staring back at her. For the first time, she saw a woman who was strong, who was capable, who was worthy of being loved. And it wasn't because of her appearance or her family's name. It was because she had finally come into her own. As she stepped away from the mirror, William entered the room, his presence immediately filling the space. His eyes softened as he took in her appearance. "You look stunning," he said, his voice filled with admiration. Isabella smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "I'm starting to feel like I belong here, William." William walked over to her, his gaze never leaving hers. "You always have," he said softly. "You just had to believe it." Isabella looked at him, her heart swelling with emotion. She had been afraid for so long, afraid of being rejected, afraid of not measuring up. But with William by her side, she had learned to let go of those fears. She had learned to believe in herself. "I don't know what the future holds," she said quietly, "but I know I'm not afraid anymore." William reached out and gently took her hand in his. "And I'll be right here with you," he said, his voice full of promise. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their moment, and Isabella turned to see her father walking into the room. His expression was neutral, as always, but there was something in his eyes that Isabella couldn't quite place. "Isabella," he said, his tone formal. "The guests are arriving. We should make our appearance." Isabella nodded, her heart still heavy with the weight of her father's expectations. She had always lived to please him, to follow his rules, to do what was expected of her. But now, standing beside William, she realized that she didn't have to live her life according to anyone's expectations but her own. As they made their way to the grand hall, Isabella's mind raced. She knew the world would always have its opinions, always have its expectations. But she was no longer afraid of them. She had William. She had herself. And for the first time, that was enough. The evening passed in a blur of conversation, laughter, and music, but Isabella remained focused on one thing: the steady presence of William by her side. She was no longer the quiet, overlooked girl she had once been. She was Isabella Lancaster, a woman who had found her place in the world, not because of her family's name, but because of the love and respect she had earned. As the night drew to a close, William turned to her, his eyes shining with pride. "You've come so far," he said quietly. Isabella smiled, her heart full. "And I couldn't have done it without you." William leaned down, brushing a soft kiss to her forehead. "You never had to do it alone," he whispered. And as they stood there together, Isabella knew that no matter what the future held, she was ready to face it. With William by her side, she had found her strength, her purpose, and most importantly, her place in the world. The days grew longer, and with each passing moment, Isabella felt herself drawn deeper into the life she was building with William. She had once feared that she would never find her place, that she would always be the quiet, overlooked daughter, lost in the shadows of her family's expectations. But now, standing by William's side, she had found a purpose. She had found a future. The estate felt less like a cage and more like a home, a place where she could breathe, where she could grow. Yet, even as she found peace within these walls, the outside world remained as demanding as ever. Her father had never stopped pushing her to fulfill her duty to the family, to marry for the sake of their name and wealth, but now Isabella saw through it. She was no longer the girl who would simply obey. She was her own woman. One afternoon, as they sat together in the library, William looked up from his book and met her gaze. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice soft, but his eyes sharp, always attuned to her thoughts. Isabella smiled faintly. "About how much things have changed. How different my life is now." William set his book down and leaned forward, his eyes filled with understanding. "And how do you feel about that?" he asked gently. Isabella hesitated for a moment, her mind racing with all the emotions that had flooded her in recent weeks. "I feel freer than I ever thought I would. But I also feel scared." William raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Scared? Of what?" "Of losing it all," Isabella admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of making the wrong choices and ruining everything." William stood and walked toward her, his steps slow but purposeful. "You're not alone in this," he said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to be afraid of making mistakes. We all make them. What matters is how we move forward." Isabella looked up at him, his words sinking into her heart. "I don't know if I'm ready to face everything yet," she confessed. "I'm still learning how to be the person I'm meant to be." William smiled, his expression full of warmth. "You don't have to be ready. You just have to be willing to try. And I'll be with you every step of the way." Isabella's heart swelled with gratitude at his words. She had always been so afraid of disappointing those around her, of failing to live up to expectations. But with William, she no longer felt like she had to carry that burden alone. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. William sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "You've always been enough, Isabella. I've seen it from the moment we met." Isabella felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away, not wanting him to see her vulnerability. But William's gaze softened as he reached up to gently brush away the tear. "You don't have to hide your feelings from me," he said quietly. "I'm here for you, just as you are." Isabella looked into his eyes, feeling a deep sense of trust that she had never known before. She had always felt like an outsider, like she didn't belong, but with William, she finally felt seen, understood, and valued. She was ready to take the next step in her life, to face whatever challenges lay ahead, because she knew she didn't have to do it alone. And for the first time in her life, that was enough. The days grew warmer, and with each passing moment, Isabella felt a quiet sense of peace settle within her. She had become accustomed to the rhythm of life at the estate, the balance of responsibilities and moments of joy, the company of William and the slow but steady growth of their bond. It wasn't perfect, life never was, but it was enough. Enough for her to begin to believe in herself, enough to trust in the future they were building together. Yet, as the season changed, so did the expectations from the outside world. One afternoon, as they prepared for another grand gathering, Isabella stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the delicate lace at the neckline of her gown. The soft fabric felt like it held 1,000 memories, memories of a girl who had once been unsure of her place in the world. Now, she was someone else, someone more confident, more self-assured. But the shadows of her past still lingered, ever so faintly. Her father's words echoed in her mind, the constant reminder of duty and responsibility. She had chosen her own path, but what if it led her away from everything she had been taught to value? Her thoughts were interrupted as William's voice called from the doorway. "You look beautiful," he said, his presence filling the room. Isabella turned to face him, offering him a soft smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice tinged with the uncertainty that still lived within her. William's expression softened as he walked toward her, his gaze never leaving hers. "What's troubling you?" he asked, his voice gentle but filled with concern. Isabella hesitated, her hands resting at her sides as she thought of the right words. "It's just, sometimes I wonder if I've made the right choice," she confessed. "I've chosen this life, this future with you, but I still carry the weight of what I was taught. What if I'm not enough? What if I fail?" William reached for her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "You are more than enough," he said, his voice steady and filled with certainty. "You've always been enough, Isabella. I don't need you to be perfect. I need you to be real, to be yourself. And you've done that. You've chosen to stand by me, to choose yourself, and that's all I could ever ask for." His words, simple yet profound, calmed the storm inside her. She had spent so long afraid of failing, of not living up to the image others had of her. But with William, she didn't have to be anyone else. She didn't have to carry the weight of everyone else's expectations. She only had to be the woman she had become. Isabella smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered, the words filled with a sincerity she had never fully allowed herself to express. William pulled her into a gentle embrace, his arms strong around her. "You don't need to thank me," he said softly. "You've done all the work. You found yourself." Isabella leaned against him, allowing herself to feel the weight of his words, the truth that resonated deep within her. She had found herself, and with William by her side, she was ready to face whatever the future held, no matter what it looked like. Together, they would create their own path, one that was free from the shadows of the past. And in that moment, Isabella knew that, for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The next few weeks were a quiet blur for Isabella, the estate settling into a rhythm that felt more like home every day. She had learned to embrace her place by William's side, no longer questioning whether she belonged or if she had made the right choice. Every glance, every touch, every smile from him reassured her that she had. But, as time passed, Isabella found herself reflecting on the world outside the estate, on the responsibilities that still called to her. Her father's letters came regularly, each one filled with expectations, with reminders of her duty to the family. She had always lived under the weight of those letters, those demands. But now, with William, she was beginning to see that she could still fulfill her duties without losing herself in the process. She was more than just a daughter, more than just an instrument for her family's plans. She was a woman in her own right. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Isabella couldn't help but let the silence between them linger longer than usual. William, Noticing her thoughtful expression, raised an eyebrow. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his voice warm, his concern evident. Isabella hesitated, her gaze shifting to the flames dancing in the hearth. "I've been thinking about my father's latest letter," she said quietly. "About what he expects from me." William remained silent for a moment, sensing the weight of her words. Finally, he spoke. "What does he want you to do?" Isabella's voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "He wants me to return home, to take my place as his heir's companion, to carry on the family legacy. But that was never my dream. It's never been my choice." William leaned forward, his hand resting on hers, offering the steady comfort of his touch. "You don't have to choose that path, Isabella," he said softly. "Your father may expect things from you, but that doesn't mean you have to follow through with them. You have the right to choose your own future." Isabella looked up at him, his words sinking deep into her heart. She had spent so long trying to meet everyone's expectations that she had almost forgotten she had the power to make her own choices. "But what if I disappoint him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if I disappoint everyone?" William squeezed her hand, his gaze unwavering. "You won't disappoint anyone who truly matters," he said. "And you certainly won't disappoint me." Isabella's chest tightened at his words. She had always feared letting others down, but with William, she realized that there was more to life than fulfilling obligations. She could live for herself, for the life she wanted to build, not just for the legacy her father had chosen for her. "I'm scared," she confessed. "Scared that I'll lose everything I've built here, that I won't be enough." William smiled softly, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "You're more than enough, Isabella. You've already built something incredible here. But if you want to follow a different path, I'll be right here beside you. You don't have to do it alone." Isabella felt the weight of his words settle into her soul. For the first time, she realized that she didn't have to choose between her past and her future. She could have both. And with William by her side, she could face whatever challenges lay ahead. "Thank you," she whispered, her heart filled with gratitude. William leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I'll always be here for you, Isabella." The warmth of his kiss lingered, and for the first time in a long time, Isabella felt a sense of peace. She knew that, whatever the future held, she would face it with courage, with love, and with the certainty that she was enough. The days leading up to the annual summer ball were filled with a mixture of excitement and tension. Isabella could feel the weight of expectations bearing down on her, not only from her family, but also from the world outside the estate. She had grown used to the comfort of William's presence, to the way he made her feel seen and valued. But now, as the event loomed closer, she felt the pull of her old life. The life that had always dictated what she should do, what she should say, how she should be. She stood before the mirror, her reflection staring back at her, unsure of the woman she had become. The gown she wore shimmered in the soft light, a delicate shade of emerald that complemented her features perfectly. But it was more than the dress that had her attention. It was the weight of the life she was about to face. The sound of footsteps behind her broke her thoughts, and she turned to see William standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, yet his eyes soft with concern. "Isabella," he said quietly, his voice like a steady anchor in the storm of her thoughts. "Are you all right?" She forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Just thinking," she replied, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "About everything that's coming." William walked toward her, his presence filling the room. "I understand," he said softly. "The world outside is never easy to navigate. But you don't have to face it alone." Isabella turned to face him fully, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she admitted. "The expectations, the judgment, everything. I feel like I'm not the person I was before. I don't know how to fit into this new world I'm supposed to be part of." William took her hands gently in his touch grounding her. "You are exactly who you are meant to be, Isabella. You've already made your choice, and you don't have to prove yourself to anyone but yourself." His words struck deep within her, stirring something she had long buried. She had spent so long living for others, for her family, for society, that she had forgotten the importance of living for herself. "I've spent my life trying to live up to other people's expectations," she said quietly. "I don't know how to stop." William's gaze softened as he cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing lightly against her skin. "You don't have to stop," he said with a reassuring smile. You just have to start living for yourself. Everything else will follow. Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. It wasn't easy, it wasn't simple, but in that moment, she realized that she didn't have to continue living in the shadows of others. She could stand in the light, in her own light. She could be the woman she was meant to be, free from the burdens of expectations. I'm ready, she whispered, her voice strong, though still filled with the uncertainty of the unknown. William's eyes shone with pride as he leaned down to kiss her forehead gently. I'm proud of you, Isabella, he said softly. You've already taken the hardest step. As she stood there, in the quiet of the room, with William's arms around her, Isabella knew that whatever the future held, she would face it with strength, with courage, and with the love of the man who had helped her find herself. The evening ahead would bring its challenges, its expectations, but she no longer feared them. She was no longer the girl hiding in the shadows. She was Isabella Lancaster, and she was ready to live her own story. The night of the ball arrived with a quiet intensity, the air thick with anticipation and the weight of unspoken words. Isabella stood in front of her mirror, the final touches of her gown completed. The gown, a deep shade of sapphire, hugged her frame perfectly, the fabric soft yet regal. It was a symbol of her transformation, of how far she had come from the timid girl who had first arrived at the estate. She had found herself, found the strength to choose her own path, and now, she was ready to face the world. As she adjusted the delicate necklace her mother had once worn, she thought about how much had changed. A year ago, she would have stood in front of the mirror, worrying about how to please everyone, about how to fit into the mold others had created for her. But now, as she gazed at her reflection, she saw the woman she had always been beneath the surface, the woman who was ready to live her own life, on her own terms. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Isabella. William's voice came through the wood, steady and calm. Are you ready? Isabella smiled to herself, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. I'm ready, she said, her voice confident. She opened the door to find William standing in the hallway, dressed in his formal attire. His presence, as always, was commanding, but his eyes softened when they met hers. He studied her for a moment, and then, with a smile, he spoke. You look stunning. His words were simple, but they filled her with a sense of belonging, a sense of being seen for who she truly was. Isabella felt her breath catch in her throat. Thank you, she replied, her voice a little softer than usual. I never thought I could feel this, confident. William reached out, taking her hand in his. You've always had it in you, he said quietly. I'm just here to help you see it. Isabella squeezed his hand, a surge of gratitude flooding through her. With William by her side, she knew she could face anything. Together, they walked down the grand staircase, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the silence. The ballroom was a blur of colors and movement, the guests mingling, the music playing softly in the background. As they entered the room, all eyes turned toward them, the whispers starting almost immediately. Isabella could feel the weight of their gazes, but instead of shrinking back, she held her head high. This was her moment. She was no longer the girl hidden in the background. She was Isabella Lancaster, and she was ready to take on the world. The night passed in a haze of conversation, laughter, and soft music, but Isabella remained close to William, her heart steady in his presence. She could feel the tension that had once lived inside her begin to melt away, replaced by a sense of peace. She was no longer the same person who had first stepped into this world. She had found her place, not by fulfilling anyone else's expectations, but by trusting herself and the love she had found with William. As the night drew to a close, William turned to her, his eyes filled with pride. You did it, he said softly, his voice full of admiration. Isabella smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment settle over her. We did it, she corrected, her hand finding his. William's smile widened as he pulled her closer. Together, he agreed. And for the first time, Isabella truly believed that the future was theirs to shape. They were ready to face whatever came next, side by side, no longer bound by the past, but free to write their own story.